A very warm welcome to you all, and thank you all for joining this session. We've really been looking forward to this event, and it's going to be the first in what we hope is going to be a monthly recurring series that will also be a bit more public than this initial one. So the basic idea is really that we invite authors to present their research and then discuss it with a very diverse audience. I want to keep this introduction really brief to keep as much time as possible for the discussion. So let me go to my next slide. This is just a very straightforward and brief agenda. So Johan, who is one of the authors, will jump off with a presentation. And I want to use about 10 minutes for clarifying questions and most of the remaining time for comments and discussion. And then after that, Johan will briefly wrap up and I will make a few general comments too. Then housekeeping is all very straightforward as well, I think. We're recording this session, I believe, and it may be shared online later. So if you don't want to be recorded, please switch off your camera and microphone. Also, if you want to ask a question or raise a comment, then please do indicate that by raising your hand, this digital feature in Zoom, raise your digital hand. So that's it on that. So the publication that we're focusing on today is Halting European Union soybean feed imports favours ruminants over pigs and poultry. We are very happy to have three of the authors, I believe, in this session. So Johann Carlson, the first author from SLU, and he is gonna lead this session. And he's a Ph.D. candidate at the Department of Energy and Technology at the Swedish Agricultural University. And his research focuses on sustainable food systems and land use, and in particular on feed food competition in arable land. Then I think Alejandro Parodi is also here. He's a PhD student from Wageningen University in research. And his research focuses on environmental potential of black soldier fly larvae in a circular food system. Then I think that the person who's also here is Ellen Roos, and she's an associate professor at SLU. And she's also one of the research directors of Table. So yeah, that's it really for me in terms of introduction. I want to give the floor to Johan for a brief presentation about the research, and then after that I will come back for the questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Walter, and thank you, Walter and Matthew, for inviting me to this really great initiative. So I will share my screen. Yes. Can you all see it? Perfect. So first, I just wanted to give some brief background on why we did this. And it sort of sprang out from we had previously been doing some scenario modeling of reducing food competing feed to livestock. And we wanted to sort of take that further, or in some way take it a step back by sort of looking at not excluding all food competing feeds, but looking at, okay, where is the place where we would start going in this direction? And for us, the obvious case then was soybean, as this is a crop that is currently predominantly used as animal feed, but it's really well equipped for being a crop and more used for human consumption, and perhaps leading the way towards more plant-based diets. And of course, also with the big environmental concerns related to soybean production. And we had also been seeing some LCAs on substituting soybean for European produced alternatives, and also some EU policy promoting protein production in Europe. But we hadn't seen so much on sort of the scalability of this. So that's why we wanted to look at, okay, if we just cut soybean imports, how much of our current livestock production could we potentially sustain, and what would it mean? So I was asked to just prepare some of the main conclusions to freshen up the memory before we go to the discussions. So now I will go forward. So our main conclusion was that we couldn't, maybe intuitively also understood, maintain all of our current livestock production without imported soybean. And we found in our different scenarios 18 to 25% reduction in animal source food production in terms of edible protein and fat. But we also found that by increasing the uptake of plant source food, especially soybean and other pulses and vegetable oils, the supply of nutrition to EU populations could be largely maintained. And we ran this optimization model, and what we saw was that ruminants were favored in this over pigs and poultry, mainly because they could utilize rough feeds such as grass and other forage crops that were not available for the monogastric animals. And sort of an interesting thing that we didn't expect a priori was that in the model we saw that maize silage wasn't possible to utilize in the extent that it's used today. So we saw that it's some sort of link between maize silage and perhaps the large soybean imports, where maize silage might be some form of lock-in to larger dependence on protein-rich animal feeds. And we also saw that LCAs used alone, looking at solely the environmental impact of substituting something for something else, is hard to use to guide policy because it does not account for these different interconnections and resource limitations in food systems that we try to account for in this study. So it's hard to look at LCAs and know something about the scalability of the proposed solution. So that was this quick main conclusions I had. So back to you, Walter.
Yes, so yeah, I guess, any questions? I can't see hands. I could start with a question myself. I wonder if you can say a little bit more about the differences between those three scenarios that you introduced, that you've looked at, and also sort of, yeah, what they mean for different average diets, maybe, if that, yeah.
Yeah, so the different scenarios we looked at was, first we looked at a case where, so the first step was basically, if we omit soybean from feed rations and try to use the remaining feeds in the most optimal way possible in terms of producing edible protein, where would that leave us? And we saw that that left us with some cereals and other energy-rich feeds not being fully utilized, and thus freeing up some arable land where we could grow other things. And this was the land we considered for the different scenarios. So in the first one, we looked at increasing production of pulses and soybean used directly for animal feeding, which left us with the least reduction in animal source foods. And in the second scenario, and yeah, I should say that in this first scenario, we could see that the reduced use of soybean meal also led to a reduced supply of soybean oil, which is co-produced in the soybean crushing, which in the way we set up the scenarios, we wanted to make sure that we didn't have any unbalances. So we assumed that this oil would need to be replaced by something. And we assumed palm oil as the most likely candidate to replace it. So the second scenario is a bit sprung out of this trade-off where we reduce demand for cropland to grow soybean, but we increase demand for cropland to grow palm oil. So therefore, we wanted to look at a scenario where we instead focus on increasing the production of oil in Europe to avoid this. So therefore, in this second scenario, we assumed an increased production of rapeseed oil, where the meal from that rapeseed oil production was used to feed animals, and the oil was used to in part supplement EU diets, the reduction in fat from reduced consumption of animal foods, but also to supply to the global market to avoid this need to replace soybean oil with palm oil. And in the last scenario, we tried to, coming from the need to move towards more plant-based diets, we also wanted to look at a scenario where we would instead produce more plant sources of protein and fat on EU cropland and not focus on producing more animal feeds there.
I see a question from Mike Ham. Can you? Yes.
First of all, this was a really interesting paper. I think it's the first paper I've ever read that preferenced ruminant products over pork and poultry. So I thought, and I know you've got a disclaimer in there in the discussion around climate, greenhouse gases and other things, but that was very interesting. I guess my question's more around kind of the production strategies in the EU, because here, so I'm in Michigan in the upper Midwest, and the dairy farmers around me are raising both corn silage and alfalfa silage. And then I assume they're mixing them when they feed to the animals. So I'm kind of surprised that in the EU, it looks like there's no rotation with the grains, that it's grain after grain after grain, because it doesn't look like there's that much pulse production. And is there a reason why there's not larger amounts of leguminous crops raised as in rotation with corn?
A really good question that I don't really have the answer to. One thing to bear in mind looking at the numbers from this study is that we only looked at the cropland used in the EU to produce animal feed. So this does not include pulses used for other purposes, human food. But I wouldn't imagine that that is a really large area either. So I don't know if we have someone else on the call that knows more about why we don't see more pulses on EU cropland.
Well, and before anybody else jumps in, maybe if they have an answer, but part of the reason I'm asking is because your scenarios imply the necessity for a large-scale transition of what agriculture is currently producing. And at least in my experience, transitions occur most reasonably when there's examples that other farmers can look to, because a lot of the knowledge is passed farmer to farmer. And if there's not a lot of experience in the EU with good rotations of cereals with leguminous crops, I can imagine it being a much harder task to get that rotation going. So I'll just leave it at that. But thanks.
Then George.
Thanks very much. I mean, this isn't actually relating to the question I was going to ask, but I'm currently doing some work through LEAP, the livestock environment, and people program around crop rotations and in Europe, and difficulties in trying to expand crop rotations specifically regarding inclusion of leguminous crops. And So yeah, I can maybe speak a little bit about that if anyone's interested, but more specifically, I was wondering if you could just explain a little bit more about the less mileage maize silage ruminants. I didn't quite understand whether that was an input that you had for your model, or that was just sort of thrown out the other end. And then if it's that latter, you know, just sort of that's what your model showed. Could you just explain a little bit more about the causal relationships between where that finding came from and what it might mean?
Yeah, so this was not something, this was not an input, it was something thrown out from our optimization model. And the reason why it was omitted from the rations during the optimization was basically because it has a quite low protein to energy ratio. So when we ran the optimization model, we saw some substitution effect where ruminant rations included more cereals and less maize silage, since cereals had a bit higher protein to energy ratio, and was also sort of cheap within the optimization since the amount of cereals fed to monogastric animals was reduced. So this feed was sort of available, and this not using the maize silage allowed to use less of these protein-rich feeds in the ruminant diets, and a bit more of that could be used for the monogastric animals, leading to a higher total edible protein supply from the livestock in the scenarios.
I see next question from Matt.
Thank you very much. It's a really interesting paper. I really enjoyed reading it. I found it really nuanced and balanced, and so great job. I really liked it. My question was around the alternative, your sort of first scenario where you substitute soya for other protein sources, feed protein sources that you could grow in the EU, so pulses. And I wondered whether you found any difference in the protein content of those pulses when you're putting together the diets for the rations and things for the livestock, because from what I understand, the reason people use soya is because it's particularly high in protein. It makes it's great for feed and better than lupins, for instance. And so whether would you need a greater land area of, say, lupins to grow an equivalent amount of protein compared to soya? Because you mentioned in your methods that you increase the levels of the pulses proportionally to how they were produced currently in the UK, in the EU, sorry, but whether there was differences between those pulses and their protein contents, and therefore whether a more efficient scenario could arise if you just focused on the one with the highest protein content.
Yeah, I think we haven't really looked into that, but I think it might have been more land use efficient to perhaps produce more soybean also in the EU and not the other pulses, because as you say, they are lower in protein compared to energy. And for this reason, we also saw when we substituted soybean meal for this mix of different pulses and also some soybean meal produced from EU soybean, we saw that the rations for the monogastric animals had to include less cereals in percent of the dry matter in the feed rations. So the rations shifted from including a certain level of cereals and then a lot of soybean meal to including a bit less cereal and then more of these different pulses. So, but yeah, we hadn't really looked into it. There are probably a number of ways in which this could be further optimized in terms of exactly which type of crops that would be, but we landed at sort of looking at these, the ones that are produced currently, and also soybean in the EU today is only produced at a scale in quite few countries. So that's why we wanted to look at this more mix of different pulses.
That sounds sensible. Thanks.
John, and Johan, maybe you could turn off your screen sharing so we can see.
Oh yeah, sure.
People.
Sorry.
Yeah, sort of just following up George's question, because I still haven't got my head around the maize silage issue, because from what you were saying about the optimization, it sounded like that would already be the case, that you'd already optimize over cereals instead of maize silage if they have a kind of more optimum price and energy balance. So I'm still not really clear what's going on there. I mean, I wonder, is maize being grown primarily for monogastrics, and then if you reduce the numbers for other reasons like a change in soy, is that maybe what's going on? I don't know.
Yeah, so what we saw was this mainly for the maize silage, so only for the ruminants. But we didn't factor in any sort of economic costs or other reasons to grow this or that. So I guess this substituting some of the roughage feed for cereals, I would imagine being more costly. And also I could also imagine there being some problems, like we tried to have a rigorous method to look at the rations and the nutritive qualities of them, but we didn't include everything. And so this substituting maize silage in ruminant diets to cereals might pose some problems, looking at maybe the fiber content of the entire diet becoming skewed, perhaps. But so in our optimization model, we only it was only a factor of the model trying to use the available feeds in the best way and not caring if some feed is more costly to produce or not. If that explains, or otherwise you might fill out a follow-up.
I think I need to investigate the paper more. I'm still not really following what's changed to make you reduce the maize silage that your model wouldn't say, I'll go and do it in real life now already, even with the current distribution of soybeans. I think that's what I've not quite caught on to. Maybe I need to go and reread details.
Yeah, like the reduced inclusion of maize silage was when we cut off the soybean meal, the imported. So I guess that is the big probably reason, because currently maize silage is included in ruminant diets as well as imported soybean, and that was sort of what we were getting at in the paper, that those two are like complementary to each other, one really low in protein and the other one really high. So yeah, that's what we were trying to get at with that increasing maize silage over other forage, other grasses, or especially forages with mixtures of grass and leguminous crops might allow for reduced dependence on these protein-rich feeds.
Yes, Matt again, I think. And Ellen, I saw you raise your hand at some point, but I don't know if you still want to comment, but you could do that after Matt.
I was just to say on the maize point that, and perhaps I don't know if this answers John's question at all, but certainly in the UK, the maize is used often by dairy farmers who have particularly high yielding varieties of cattle. So say your Holstein, Friesian crosses and so on. And it's, you know, you kind of see it sometimes used in the zero graze systems and things where the cattle are kept inside all year round. And it's because exactly as Johan's saying, that it's so high in sugars that it's kind of rocket fuel, if you like, for these high yielding cows. Whereas you might see sort of grass legume forage mixes used in slightly more extensive or organic systems and things. But I've found it quite a nice output of your scenarios that maize was reduced, because it's also one of the most sort of environmentally damaging forages to grow, at least in the UK, because you harvest it late in the season, so October, when the soils are wet, and it often makes it too late to establish a cover crop over the winter, and also you cause quite a lot of compaction and runoff and soil erosion if you harvest it in poor conditions and things. But I don't know if that helps at all. The reason farmers use it is because this is what you need to feed these high yielding cattle to make them yield high, kind of thing. And if you want to switch to a different system, you might need to switch your cattle, and it sort of comes back to transitions and things. I don't know if that helps at all answer your question about why people use maize.
Thanks.
Ellen, you still want to make your comment? Otherwise, Helen?
Yeah, go ahead. I mean,
Cool.
In figure 5, you summarise the nutrient output of the different scenarios. And looking at iron, the level of iron provided by the baseline scenario is actually very low. Why is that? And does it mean that levels of iron in diets currently are low?
Yeah, it's important to remember, looking at that figure, is that we look only at the animal source food supply of nutrition, but compare it to the entire needs. So the actual supply of these different nutrients to the EU diet is higher for many of the nutrients. So iron we get a lot from different also plant-based products. And I don't think we have iron deficiency in our diets. So.
Does it answer your question, Helen?
Yes, thanks.
I see a question from Kini.
Yes, thank you. Well, also I was quite pleased with this paper. It's not completely my field as a food technologist, but it was very interesting to see all these things come together. But I've looked at it also with the eye of a food technologist, and I also have some questions in relation to that, if I may. Mm-hmm. So you talk about protein quality in replacing animal protein with plant proteins. And you mainly look, I think, at amino acid composition. But there's more to proteins than just amino acid composition. So I was wondering if you also take into account that generally plant proteins are more difficult to digest for humans, and therefore you may need more than you actually need with animal proteins because they're usually easier to digest.
Yeah, we didn't account for that per se. We used a sort of edible fraction at 0.8 for the plant, all the plant foods, but we didn't account for any digestibility differences in the protein. Do you know? I don't know so much about this. How big a difference is it?
Well, it really depends on the protein. Soy is reasonable, but other plant sources may be quite low. So it really it can be 60-70% of the quality of animal proteins, but it really depends. I think soy is probably around 80-90% of what you can achieve with animal proteins. I had another question. I was a bit surprised that chicken is doing so badly in your comparison. And that also brings me to a technological related question. We did some calculations here in marketing also about meat replacers, where we found out that chicken is actually doing quite well in terms of conversion of feed into high quality protein. If you want to produce meat replacers, you actually need quite a lot of processing to turn the plant proteins into something comparable like a piece of chicken meat. So I was a bit surprised that chicken is not coming out so well in your report. So could you maybe explain a little bit more why that is?
Yeah, I think it's in some way poultry and pig went sort of hand in hand and were out competed by the ruminants in the optimization. And this is largely because this large pool of feeds made up of roughages available in Europe is unavailable to them. So which favored the ruminants. But then you could ask yourself why pig meat was at all remained while poultry was reduced. And I think part of the explanation, which we also saw in some sensitivity analysis, was that we like current recommendations for including rapeseed meal, which in the scenarios became a quite important protein feeds for the especially for all livestock. The inclusion to both pigs and poultry is generally limited, and therefore we also limited it in the model. But we looked at a case where we omitted this limitation, and then poultry were favored over pigs in the scenarios, which is explained by, as you say, their higher feed conversion efficiency. Yeah. So I think they were a bit limited by this maximum inclusion rate of rapeseed meal.
Yeah, okay. Well, overall, I'm quite happy with what you presented in the paper, and of course also your co-authors. But I think what if I may make a critical remark, I would say that you in the future should also include, let's say, the environmental aspects of needing to process plant proteins into edible foods for humans, because that would actually be quite considerable.
Yeah, and a topic I'm really sort of thinking a lot about looking at this proposed moving towards more plant-based diets is the sort of health impacts of these more refined plant-based foods that I find it really hard to get a grasp of what might be the consequences on a sort of population health level of moving towards these foods. And I guess they are quite new, so I guess we don't really know yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting topic for future research, I would say. Thank you.
I'd like also more to see, would be interested in more sort of general questions and comments. For example, I'm quite interested in sort of the policy dimensions of this, and I wonder, Johan, if you have any sort of, what would be takeaway things for messages for policymakers from this research, or do you think this is sort of more an academic exercise? How far is it from sort of explicitly trying to influence policy, do you think?
Yeah, I think we struggle a bit with that writing this paper, and like there are some more concrete things, such as the thing with the maize silage, that might perhaps be more directly relevant to policymakers. But I think it's more of a contribution to the debate and showing that policy can't focus single-handedly on either agriculture or food consumption patterns, since it's so much connected. And so, but I would be really happy to hear if someone else on the call has some more sort of this, how can this be achieved, or how can we move towards something better, or do we want to move in this direction? Or yeah.
Mike, sorry, I see your hand.
Yeah, I'll just make a couple comments, Johan, if you're interested. You know, next fall, there's going to be the World Food System Conference or whatever it's summit, whatever it's going to be called. And there's a lot of concern that it's going to be much ado about nothing and suck a lot of energy out of a lot of good work that's going on globally right now. And from my perspective, part of what I think is really important is for either countries or regions like the EU to start really thinking about what would it mean to source the vast majority of our food supply from in country or in region. I know, you know, this is, you know, an excellent treatise on how basically all the importation of soybeans is causing a lot of deforestation and destruction of native grasslands and things like that in Brazil. But a lot of our produce, a lot of our imports, a lot of ours are coming from Mexico, Central America, where we get all of our bananas, and you're getting a lot of your produce from Africa and from parts of the Mediterranean that are going to be challenged with droughts going forward. And so kind of rethinking food supplies, I think, is a critical element of this. And, you know, from my standpoint, the interesting thing that for me, kind of the next step, the next stage of what I'd like to see somebody doing with respect to what you've just done here is to think about, okay, now let's take this and expand the dietary pattern and think about other things and look at, so if we did kind of cut our imports of soybeans, and now we start cutting our imports of some other things too, and think about what can we do more in region across the EU, what would that mean for the landscape? And also then what does that mean for the dietary patterns of the population? You know, I think for me, I mean, what your data showed in terms of nutrition, because that's where my training is iron is really the biggest issue. And, you know, I would argue there's probably a fair bit of iron deficiency across the EU, at least if it's anything similar to the US, especially in premenopausal women, there's a fair bit here in the US. So I think iron is a really important nutrient. Protein, I'm not, quite frankly, in the developed world, not as worried about, because we tend to eat much more protein than we need anyway. So I think there's a lot of policy opportunities. I know there's some EU reports on the food system and sustaining the food system going forward that have some interesting things in it. But I think there's some interesting policy implications here that can feed into how do we go about changing the food system so the dietary patterns and agriculture and the supply chain shift in tandem with one another so that we get to more healthy and sustainable diets. And I think, you know, looking at these import issues, I think is a really important piece of that equation. So, you know, I would encourage you to think about kind of how does this research tie into what's going on with global thinking around the Food Systems Summit for next fall. I'll let it go with that.
Oh.
We have about 5 minutes left, and maybe you could get the last question from, or a comment from John, and then maybe Johan, you could try to wrap up, and then I could end with a few things about table 2.
A bit related to what Mike was saying about kind of local production. So if you think of what you showed in kind of a historical context, do you think it sort of makes sense if you imagine, well, actually, historically in Europe, we did eat relatively more ruminants compared to monogastrics than we do now. Certainly chickens, pigs were a bit different because of the ban on feeding them food waste. But in one sense, you're showing, well, if you take away all the soy imports, then we're back to a more ruminant-focused consumption of animal products, which is maybe just where biogeographically European domestic food supply is anyway.
Yeah, I think there is something there that this sort of winds back the time maybe, because as far as I know, soybean import increase has gone in tandem with the increase of poultry production. So yeah, and I've also been sort of struggling with this. Should I do some wrap up now? Was that yeah? I'll share some questions that I don't have a clue at, but so yeah, we were a bit into this with progressive policy, as we stated in the paper, and what is it, and sort of what can be done. And yeah, I'm trying to learn about the new CAP in the EU and how that relates to moving this policy in a more food systems direction. And I was also a bit interested at sort of this, we have a lot of grasslands in Europe, and from what I understand, many of them are sort of ryegrass or something. And I'm a bit curious on the potential to introduce legumes, not only on cropland, but also in these the European grasslands, and what that could do. And also, this paper goes into this cutting demand and maybe a bit towards this localized food chain kind of way in trying to reduce pressure to deforest new areas. But I am also not completely certain that that is the way, or how we most effectively can make things change in a desired direction. So yeah, is it a better way to sort of try to affect supply chains from within? And I was also a bit intrigued by this absurd trade-offs we saw, where we could reduce demand for land in South America, but the demand for land in Southeast Asia increased. And yeah, we tried to look at some ways to see, was this trade-off really bad or not so bad? And so we looked at these factors for species loss from different commodities from different regions, and also on carbon lost from different regions due to commodity trade. And from that, we could see that for the species loss indicator, we were actually worse off by reducing demand for land in South America drastically, but then increasing it a bit in Southeast Asia. And these calculations weren't robust, and we didn't include it in the paper, but it sort of sparked some questions from my side. So that is, I think, my wrap up. And yeah, if someone wants to remain and discuss this a bit more, I'm happy to stay.
Yeah, so I'll just yeah, wrap up sort of from table as well. I want to thank you all very much for your participation. I think this is really a great session. And also, of course, special thanks to Johan, who has, yeah, managed to answer all those difficult questions, I think. And yes, indeed, I want to emphasize, if you feel your question hasn't been answered or still want to make a comment, then Johan and we all will stay a bit longer on the call, so we could continue the discussion, but feel free to leave as well if you're busy. Also, if you have any comments or feedback on this event and the general sort of template of it, then please write me or one of my colleagues, and we would really, yeah, we'd really be interested in hearing your feedback on it. Yeah, so as I said, we want to sort of make this a more publicly recurring event. So any input on that is just very welcome, and also any suggestions for new publications that you think could be interesting to bring into those sessions. Yeah, if you would like to stay involved and hear more about those future events, just write a message in the chat or send a message to one of us. And also, please all subscribe to Fodder, our newsletter, if you haven't. I think one of my colleagues could write the URL in the chat. Yeah, so I want to leave it there. And again, many thanks for your participation, and we hope to see you next time, and have a good weekend all.
Thank you so much, Walter, for organizing this.
Well, thank you. And really, anyone with questions, just yeah, we should continue to raise the hands or just start asking them. That's fine as well.
Yeah, I'm just gonna hop in for a quick second. I'm also really curious because we have 2 other authors of the paper on the call to hear what they have to say. If you potentially disagree with anything that Johan said or want to add any extra kind of clarification, as you certainly had input and thought about this paper quite a lot as well. So yeah, I don't know, either Edin or Alejandro, if you have anything particular to add.
Good afternoon, everyone. As a South America, I'm very triggered by the last question that Johan posted at the end, like, what is an hectare worth? And I'm thinking, like, how, as a South American, like, what will happen with that free land in Brazil, right? In this case, we made the assumption that the excess for oil that we needed to get it from Southeast Asia was coming from there, but we could also have made the assumption that that oil was coming from that free land as well. And that might change also the view. And of course, there is a whole discussion on biodiversity, but also we have to remember that, I mean, these lands, and it's an hypothetical case, right? No soybean imports to the EU, but those lands are still under production and will probably be still under production if the EU is not demanding their products. So that is something very interesting for me. Like, what can Brazil do, or Argentina as well, with these lands if, in case there is less demand for soy? Maybe other countries will get it, right? And there will be a switch in other places. Maybe they can reforest it, and we had some discussions on it before. But it's a topic that, for me, it's really exciting to think about.
Can I maybe respond to that? Because I wrote a building block for a table on soy and its links to land use change and so on. And this is exactly one of the things that came up, I think. And I think the general worry is that then demand will just or at least exports from Brazil, for example, will just switch to China. And there's this whole thing like, will China be as focused on responsible certification and so on as the EU? Yeah, so I don't have answers there, but I think it's this assumption of trying to limit isn't, yeah, the European soy imports is indeed very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but as a modeling exercise, and I think I also very happy that I was invited to participate, because it's really a demonstration of how system thinking should be, I think, to try to solve these challenges in the food system. So that's very nice.
Yeah, and it's also like, when we sort of think about this, we generally think in a sort of static sense, that we from one day to the next omit soybean, and then land that is currently in production is no longer under demand. But a different way to perceive it might be that this happens gradually, and that this reduced demand might mean a constant demand, so no more deforesting new areas. And I guess those 2 ways of looking at it yields very different results, because in the latter one, there would still be production on land that is already deforested, but perhaps a lower demand to deforest new areas.
Yeah.
Maybe I should say something also then, Matthew. You wanted me to...
Only if you want to. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
We're
in comfortable territory now too.
Yeah, I mean, it's fine. I think Johan is the best person to answer all these questions. But I think it was really interesting to hear what the participants, wanted to discuss and bring up, and that's I was like several times wanting to jump in and say something, but yeah. But I think what we wanted to, one of the main points we wanted to make with this paper also, I think, is that this kind of waste in using such a valuable crop as soy as animal feed. It's one of the most nutritious plant-based foods you can think of, and we're using it as animal feed. I mean, that's a real waste. And then another thing is this, what Johan said initially, that, okay, so soy is seen as a problem. And then, okay, let's just substitute it for like in here in Sweden, there's quite a few initiatives to substitute soybean for fava bean. And of course we can do that, but fava bean is also an excellent food crop. And since it's lower yielding than soy, we would need more land. So just thinking about soy as kind of a bad crop and just substitute it for some other legume that we can grow here in Europe doesn't really solve the problem. The main problem that using these pulses for feed is really a waste. So yeah, that was just one comment from me.
Yeah, I was also quite curious about that. And yeah, when we talked about this, setting up this session, we didn't know what avenue people would go, because there's kind of a lot of different threads that people can pull on and hear and investigate. But I wonder if if there's any sort of kind of regulations on soy coming in as a food crop versus a feed crop from South America. If there's kind of policy that's already kind of guiding that, and if there is, or if there isn't, what would it take to move towards maybe a trade pattern that prioritized it as a food crop?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe Alejandro, you know more about this, I think.
No, so I don't have the answer to the question. If there are any initiatives to switch the market of soybean as feed and for food. No, I really don't know. But as it was mentioned before, it also probably will depend on the developments in fruit processing capacities, right? If people want to consume meat, and then they will switch to meat replacers made of soy, and they look really like the same, then that might increase the chances to create new markets. And there is a lot of discussion going on the processing of plants or foods every time they look more and taste like meat. And as it was mentioned before, it will be also very nice to know what will be the environmental impacts. Usually in LCAs, most of the impacts are during the production of raw materials, right? The processing should be kind of the same between processed animals or processed plants or foods, at least in terms of environmental impacts. But yeah, we are in a transition. I think we might have that answer in some years. I don't know.
This would be actually a really brilliant segue if we did have this lined up as our next essay author, but there is a paper that came out and we featured it in Table about the environmental impacts and a lot of other kind of socio-ecological implications of alternative meats, of lab-based proteins. And so it didn't come to anything conclusive, but it was kind of a pretty large systematic review, preliminary analysis of looking at some of these impacts, and then we can tie that in very smoothly. We don't have that particularly set up, but if that is a topic that other people are interested in, then perhaps we can ask that author if she wants to be part of Ask the Author.
Yeah, that's a good idea. But what I also wanted to kind of highlight is that I don't think that plant-based necessarily always have to be these heavily processed foods. There's surely a consumer group that really wants the meat-like products, that's for sure. So I think they definitely have a place. But there's also some quite unprocessed foods coming out. I mean, there's this legume mince in Sweden now on the market, and it's very similar to beef mince. You can use it in lasagna, in bolognese, meatballs, and it's not processed. They just took 3 different types of legumes and they boiled them. Of course, they soak them and boil them as you need to do with all legumes, and then they just cut them in different fractions, and they worked quite a lot to get kind of the right mix to make it, meat-like in texture and so on. And I don't think this is much different from like soy, the extruded soy mince. And it's not processed at all, really. It's just soaked, boiled, and then mixed. And I think that's quite interesting. So I think sometimes when we talk about this transition, we're thinking about the most processed products we can imagine, but of course those can also be very good to have. Like if you're, you want to have your hot dog and you want to have it in a shape of a sausage, but there's so many different ways I think we can still invent of, and there is lots of traditional ways also, of course, of eating plant-based food. So.
Yeah, but I think that what you mentioned, Ellen, is also processing. And now we are entering into a semantic discussion, what is processing, but the things that you describe is also processing. You are heating, you are mixing, you are probably drying. So there's a lot of processing going on.
I was going to say that boiling is quite energy intensive.
It is indeed, yeah.
So you still need to do the comparison, but I totally agree. Yeah, when we're talking about alternative proteins, we shouldn't only think about the kind of meat analogs. There are many more traditional types that we shouldn't forget to.
I agree. But there was one other thing that I would like to mention is about the policy implications. Suppose that it should be possible to ban soy protein from South America. What would happen to South America, and what would be the consequences there if the world would stop importing a lot of soy proteins?
Yeah, that was a bit what I was going at with this second question, that I don't think it's kind of like this nationalistic, protectionistic path to go to just, but yeah, I guess it's different things also with not using quality food crops for animal feed is one aspect, and another aspect is where are the crops sourced.
I can see that point, but I think that it becomes so complicated. I once heard the CEO of Unilever say that the refugee problem that we face in Europe at the moment is actually due to a change in land use, a change in climate. So everything that we change in the food system will also have its consequences on all kinds of social disturbances that are quite unpredictable. So I'm not saying we should not do it, but I mean, it can have a large, totally unexpected consequences. Anyway, it's a wicked problem, as they call it.
Yeah, because it's always when we identify something that needs to change, there always follows. But if we change it in this way, then we will end up with other problems. And I think it's hard it's so easy to get locked in, I think, also in.
No, but I think the nice thing about your work is that you sketch scenarios, and with those scenarios you can start to think about what would be the consequences of all that. So it's definitely very worthwhile to do what you do. But it's hard to make definitive conclusions, I think.
Yeah.
Anyway, I will have to leave at 4. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Tini. Thank you everyone for coming. While we have this kind of dedicated group at the end, we just want to note that this is a series that we want people to participate in and join, and also invite other authors and other papers. So we are kind of looking at the people from our own institutions, but we're not restricting it to that. So if there's a paper that came out recently and you'd like to kind of engage with it in a deeper way, or in this sort of way, please let us know, because we're intending to host this every month, and even if we don't book it maybe for this month, we can line it up down the line. So yeah, again, thank you everyone for coming, and have a good weekend, everyone.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you very much, and see you all.